sliding dovetails are trash, and I'm going to show you why. Okay, deep breaths. Relax. I'm mostly being facetious. Mostly. Sliding dovetails aren't trash. They're not my favorite joint. I will admit this from the front. I do not like the sliding dovetail for a myriad of reasons we will get into, but they have their place. I will say that I think the sliding dovetail is good under very specific circumstances. And those specific circumstances don't come along that often, so I don't really ever use them. I have in the past in, I think, maybe 2 or 3 pieces. But that's it. Other than that, there are other options that are, in my opinion, better, more efficient, easier options to use and assemble than the sliding dovetail. But the reason this video is coming up is because a couple of weeks ago, I put out a video on a cabinet joint that I use often when I'm making small wall hanging cabinets or larger floor standing cabinets, the housed mortise and tenon joint. I do it using a domino. It's super fast, it's super efficient, it's really easy to cut, and it's very, very strong. And a lot of folks in the comments were asking, what about a sliding dovetail? And that's a fair question to ask because the sliding dovetail's been around for, I don't know, millennia, I'm gonna guess, and it has its place in furniture. So why don't I use the sliding dovetail in that specific circumstance? I'm going to tell you why. So, before I tell you why I don't like the sliding dovetail, let's talk about what it is and what it's actually good for. So a sliding dovetail is really just a fancy dado. What is a dado? That's a fair question. A dado is nothing more than a piece of wood with a slot cut in it, a dado being across the grain, a groove being along the grain. That's just bonus facts for you. And a positive piece that fits into that dado. Now, the thing to know about the dado is it's super strong in this orientation. However, sometimes you need to join wood in this orientation. And in this orientation, the dado is not super strong. And so, in order to make this joint stronger and give it what's called mechanical advantage, all we've done is flare out these sides to lock it in place to make sure that even without glue, this can't dislodge in this orientation. That's all a sliding dovetail is. So we've got the positive aspect of a dado, and we've got the positive aspect of a dovetail. Very, very similar. One's flared, one's straight. And our corresponding negative piece, our slot, is also flared in that regard so that when I slide this in, it is impossible to take that out. Super strong joint, super useful in very specific applications. And the biggest benefit to this joint is, of course, the fact that you don't need glue. Now, do you still use glue with this joint? Absolutely, of course you do. You want your furniture to stay together, don't you? However, bear in mind that in centuries past, they were using hide glue or variations thereof, and those glues, those natural glues, didn't last all that long. They tended to break down, especially over time, and with the introduction of moisture, they just got weaker and weaker. So having something like a sliding dovetail that has a real mechanical advantage is a real advantage when you're dealing with subpar adhesives. Now, I can hear you saying, Eric, this sounds so far like a brilliant joint, and you say you don't like it, but I don't see a disadvantage. It's got all of the strength of a dado in compression and all of the mechanical advantage of a dovetail in tension. What could possibly be bad about this joint? And that's a fair question. Well, there's a few things that are very, very difficult about the sliding dovetail. Number one, you may know this from your own experiences. I'm sure that you do. Wood doesn't always like to play nicely. Sometimes wood warps, it cups, it bows, it twists, it does things. Even after you mill it, it may not be perfectly flat. And cutting and assembling a sliding dovetail in a piece of wood that is not flat is quite literally impossible. It is mechanically impossible. You can't have that wedge travel along an arc. Can you force it? Can you do some things? Can you play with it? Yes, and will it be advantageous in some areas in order to keep things flat? For sure. But it just makes life really, really difficult in that regard. Now, number two, and this is a much more common problem, is the straight sliding dovetail is really difficult to glue up, because if you take a piece that is straight and it has tension, or not tension, man, words. Words, man. And it has friction along the entire length of the joint, and you go to slide that joint together. That's reasonably stiff as it is, and that's probably over about 5 inches. Now imagine when I go to put glue on this. When I go to put some yellow glue on it, which is of course the most common type of glue, and it's water-based and it swells that joint, and you drive that joint about 2/3 of the way home, and then the glue seizes up because the joint's too tight, it's swelled, and now you're freaking out. What the hell do you do? Right? This is an issue. This is a major problem with the dovetail. So, you can of course, I rest my case. You can, of course, make this looser, but then you have a loose joint. It's very, very finicky to get that right in order to have the right amount of glue tolerance and still have a nice, tight, clean, visually appealing joint. Now, there are fixes to that. We can introduce what's called a tapered sliding dovetail, but we're gonna get into that in a little bit. The third reason, and the main reason why I use another joint instead of a sliding dovetail in most of my cabinetry is because my cabinet walls tend to be very close to the edge of my base plate. And when they're very close to the edge of your base plate, you have a good bit of short grain right here. And when you have short grain and a wedging action, bad things can happen. Let me show you what I mean. Now here's a pretty typical joint that I might cut on a cabinet side. I have my base plate and I have my wall that will be right here. It's about 3/8 to 1/2 inch in from the side, and then I'm going to shape this profile with a hand plane. That is pretty typical of a wall hanging cabinet that I might make. Now you may notice there's not a lot of grain between the edge of the board and the start of the sliding dovetail, which means there's a fair amount of short grain right here. And so, if you're not careful, when you go to cut this joint and when you go to drive it home, you could crank this in one way or the other and blow that end grain out. That's a real issue in this situation. So much so, to prove my point, when I was cutting this sample joint, see what happened? This joint was just tight enough on the second fit where I went to drive that in about 1/2 inch and it got stuck because it was too tight and I couldn't quite get it out, and it just popped that little bit off. And if this was a real project, that would be a really frustrating situation. This particular situation, with a cabinet side so close to the edge of a base plate, the sliding dovetail is not really the ideal joint for that, which is why I developed this joint, the house mortise and tenon, which is where this video is stemming from. This is a great joint because this is not putting any mechanical leverage on the short grain at the edge of a cabinet, and it severely reduces the risk of blowing out that short grain. So that is why I don't like sliding dovetails in this particular application. If you're doing it in the middle of a board, it's great. If you're doing it at the end of a board, it can be a real problem. So all of those points bearing in mind, let's say you still want to use a sliding dovetail in your project. How do you cut one? That's an excellent question. I'm so glad you asked. Let me show you. Cue the music. Just like that, we have a sliding dovetail. Now, it's a pretty simple process, so a couple of things about that process. You always want to cut your negative first because it's much easier to fit your positive to your negative because this doesn't have that much wiggle room. You can make it wider, but you can't really make it smaller. It's easier to just tap adjust the fence on the router table to size this to your negative. So that's just the order of operations that's typically done. If you do it another way, maybe there's some school of thought there. I don't know. I'm just giving you the information that I have. Now, on cutting this piece right here, you saw me use a fence and a center line spacer. This is about as rudimentary as you can get when it comes to jig making. It's just a piece of wood with a 90-degree piece on a fence on the base, if you will. That allows me to put this up against here and clamp it in place, and I know this fence is 90 degrees to my workpiece. Now, the other piece I used, this spacer. Now look, I know these are a little bit large for the work pieces I'm using, but this is what I have cut for bigger pieces. This is just a spacer so that I can put this on here up to my center line. I can remove this, and now I know that my fence is exactly the right distance away from my handy dandy trim router. I know that this distance to the center of my bit is exactly 2 15/16 light or 7/8 heavy, depending on how you want to articulate that. And so that's the size of my spacer. I clamp this in place and I can go, and I know my work is exactly where it needs to be. My joinery is in the exact location. Now, you also saw me make a first pass with a straight bit, and then I did my second pass with my router bit, with my dovetail bit. Is it necessary? No. Is it good practice? Depends on what you're doing, really. So if I'm using a super dense wood that's gonna give a lot of wear and tear to my bits, then I'm probably gonna hog that out with a straight bit. If I'm working in poplar and it's only going a 1/2 inch deep, then it's not the end of the world if you just do it in a single pass with a dovetail bit. Just bear in mind, does not matter whether you hog out the center or you go in a single pass. Dovetail bits, just by their nature, have a weak point right here, and so they can break off. And on top of that, I've never once used a dovetail bit that doesn't sound like it's about to break off. Don't be overly worried if it sounds that way. It always makes me uncomfortable too. We're gonna get through this together. Now, lastly, on cutting the positive. You saw me use this to set the depth of my cut on both my trim router and at the router table. This establishes my depth of my dado, and I'm gonna use that exact same depth to establish the depth of my shoulder on my positive piece. And then, very simply, I'm just gonna take minor passes off of each face and slowly move that fence in, take another pass, and keep checking that fit until eventually, I'll get there, don't you just hold up. Eventually, you're gonna end up with a nice tight fit. Now the question is, how tight is tight enough? Should you be able to drive it home with a mallet while it's dry fit, or should it be a pretty easy slide like this is right now? In my opinion, I think this is about the ideal fit. It's reasonably easy to slide in and out. I got like a tiny little bit of wiggle, and by the time I apply glue to these faces, that's probably going to be very tight, and I guarantee you there's not gonna be any wiggle there. So any looser than this, it's gonna show gaps. It's not gonna be as strong as it could be. Any tighter than this, and it's gonna be a bear to get together over the 6-inch width of this joint. It's a very, very small sweet spot. And again, that's one of the downsides of this joint. But it is together and it will hold, and I don't even need glue on this. If I had another piece on the other end, this thing would be together for the next million years, especially when you consider that it is currently January and it is close to the driest time of the year. We're a month or two away from it. And so as this joint swells in, say, August and September, this thing ain't gonna go anywhere, even without glue. It's gonna be impossible to get this thing in and out. Now, another not oft articulated problem with the sliding dovetail is blowout. It doesn't matter what you do or how slow you take it, there's always going to be a little bit of blowout. In this particular instance, the front of this joint actually looks okay. That's pretty clean, and I'm happy with the way that that looks. The back of this joint, you can see, not even on my negative piece, but actually on my positive piece, I have a little bit of blowout on the shoulder there. So it's not the end of the world, but it is a thing to consider. In order to avoid that, there's a few things you can do. Of course, you can leave your pieces a little bit wider and cut your piece down to final width after and just skim off, say, 1/8 of an inch. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. You can also glue on a sacrificial piece if you're using something that's expensive or you just don't have a lot of material. Then you can glue that piece on. Say you glue on a piece of poplar, cut your joinery, and then remove that piece at the table saw. That's absolutely an option as well. Now, outside of the disadvantage of making this joint kind of difficult to assemble, the main reason I don't use it is just the aesthetics of the joint. There's nothing wrong with this. It's a beautiful joint. It looks really, really nice in a lot of different applications, but it's not necessarily my aesthetic. And the aesthetic of the object is an important consideration, right? This is something that you guys constantly articulate as part of the reason you watch my channel, is to contend with what it means to design a beautiful thing. And if I don't want the aesthetic of a sliding dovetail, then I'm probably not going to use the joint. But let's say you're in a situation where you do or have to use the sliding dovetail for whatever reason, but you don't want to see it on the front of your piece. What are you gonna do then? Well, given that this thing is essentially nothing more than a variation on a dado, and you know you can cut a stopped dado, we're gonna cut a stopped sliding dovetail. Now, in order to cut a stopped sliding dovetail, you're gonna go through the exact same process as we just did, except that you're going to stop the router cut, say a 1/2 inch from the end of your piece, whatever that measurement is. But there's no reason for me to show you how to cut a stopped sliding dovetail, because there's not really any difference between that and a straight all the way through sliding dovetail. So I promised you guys that we would talk about the tapered dovetail. So that's what we're gonna do. This is a stopped tapered sliding dovetail. This tail, this positive piece, is wider at the back than it is at the front. So when I put this into my socket, I get it back in here and it wiggles, and it's just super easy to drive it all the way in until about the last 1/2 inch or so, and now all of a sudden it's tight and I can drive it home. Now, this is a super easy thing to cut. Let's take that back. This is a relatively easy thing to cut, but it makes a huge difference in assembly because you don't have, oh boy, this is nice and tight, huh? Because you don't have the issues of the joint swelling and bogging down as you're trying to drive this over 6, 8, 12, 20 inches. And you only need to really worry about that swelling of the joint for the last 1/2 inch or so. So there is literally no pressure all the way through. You can see how much wiggle I have all the way through to about here, and then just a couple of mallet taps gets me all the way there. So this is a huge improvement over the straight sliding dovetail, and if ever I cut a sliding dovetail, this is the one that I use. It is always tapered, it is off stopped, so I'm gonna show you exactly how we make this variation. Guess who forgot to stop their cut? I'm gonna cut that off and we're gonna put another one right here. You hold on a second. All right, crisis averted. Try again. So, now that I have a stopped joint, not a through joint, now we need to make some adjustments. What I've got at the current moment is a straight sliding negative socket, just the same as this piece, obviously, except for the fact that it's stopped up here, but we need to make this tapered. It wants to be flared at the back, so wider at the back than it is at the front. What we're going to do to accomplish that is we're just gonna score a little pencil line right here along where this jig is set, and then we're going to move the back of this jig over by some distance. Again, that distance is completely arbitrary. It could be a 32nd, it could be an 1/8. You could absolutely make up a wooden shim spacer for this. However, playing cards are really, really nice because they are super easily adjustable by taking one away or adding one back in. It's magic, I know. What I'm gonna do is pop this off, and I'm going to keep pressure on the front of this jig, and I'm just going to try to get this spacer in here so that it is visually about the width of these playing cards. I am touching my pencil line at the front, and I've got a gap at the back And when I line these up, it is pretty dang close to the width of my playing cards. So we look like we're in good alignment. I'm gonna clamp this back down. We're gonna take a second pass on this wall to widen the back, and the front will be exactly the same. I do just want to give a quick shout out to my friends over at H Valley Tools who make this router table. This is not a sponsored video. They do not sponsor me. I have worked with them in the past, and I will admit that I did not pay for this. They did gift it to me. However, they gifted it to me once I asked for it because I used it at a demo of theirs, and I said, holy crap, that's a dope router table. I want one. This essentially is, a standard router table, except that it has a digital readout on a tablet. So I can dial this into 0 and then punch it up a 1/2 inch and be done with my settings. It's super, super nice. And I can adjust this down to, the 1,000th of an inch. I think this is a great table. So if you're looking for one, I'll leave a link in the description below. I don't get any commission on it. I just think it's a nice table. Now, the process for setting up the positive on the tapered sliding dovetail is the same on the straight sliding dovetail. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the height of my cut, which I'm going to use my depth gauge for, or in this case, my double square. This is still set to my depth. I'm going to use that to establish exactly how high my bit needs to be. I'm gonna move my fence in, and I'm gonna nibble cuts off of both sides in order to create the positive piece. The only difference is I'm going to use blue tape to tape the spacer on the back side of my positive piece to create that taper. So let's do that. So before we go any further, let's check our fit and make sure that we're looking okay. So it's nice and loose at the back, and then I'm driving it home, and it gets stuck a good inch and a half out. That's nice. It feels good. It's nice that it's tightening up. That's the whole point of this joint. But I'm never going to be able to drive it home unless I remove the front portion of this positive piece because, of course, I'm using a stopped housing. I have a funny feeling it's still a little bit fat, but we're gonna do that first. All right, so looking at the way this joint is going together, I have a sneaking suspicion that it's a little fat at the back, but it's okay at the front. But this is the reason I like the playing cards as opposed to, say, a wood shim, because if that's the case, what I can do is I can just see if I can actually just grab one of these. Come on now. Don't be finicky. There we go. So I can just pop one or two. I'm gonna take two. I'm gonna take two out, and I've just lessened the amount of taper on this piece just by removing two playing cards. This is just a super simple way to adjust that shim. So now I have a thinner shim by two playing cards. I'm going to take another pass on the tapered side, and I'm going to see if that makes a difference. So to prove my point about how finicky this joint can be, I just took out two playing cards, and now it's loose. So what that tells me, and this is why you do setup blocks when you're actually making these cuts for real, you do sample pieces. What that tells me is the taper I now think is right, but the fence is too close to the blade, too far away from the blade. Strike that, reverse it. I'm not going to change anything except I'm going to move this fence a little bit closer in order to, well, no, hold on. Let's make sure I got that right. If I move the fence closer, it's going to widen the tail. So I got that right. So I'm gonna move the fence a little bit closer. I'm gonna move these shims to the other side, just like that, and I'm gonna cut this piece on the other side to see if I can get a nice clean fit there. So, our tapered joint is looking nice. This is the second cut. That slides right in. It's nice and loose the entire way, and then it starts to lock up around a 1/2 inch out, but it's still pretty loose, and then I can drive that home with just hand pressure, which is maybe a smidge on the loose side, a smidge. But I'd be very comfortable with that still. By the time you get glue in there, that's gonna be super, super strong and much, much easier to assemble over the course of, say, 4 or more inches. So that's the stopped tapered sliding dovetail. So now that you know how to cut both iterations of this joint, the question comes to why? What is the advantage of using this joint versus, say, the housed mortise and tenon joint? And I will tell you straight up, it's a matter of preference. Don't let me or any other bully on the internet tell you that this joint is superior or lesser than whatever you choose to use. It's a great joint. It will hold up for centuries. For me, at this point in time in my career, and with the amount of objects that I've made, I have no interest in taking the difficult path just for the sake of taking it. There's no reason for me to cut a double tapered sliding dovetail when a housed mortise and tenon will do, and it's faster to do the latter than it is the former. But that's just me. If you want to make a piece that you think, even if the contemporary adhesives fail, will still last for 800 years. So if that's what you want, if that's your goal to accomplish that, then use this joint. I've already made pieces that will last multiple centuries, and there's only so much death-defying that I can do in my career. It's not a thing that I'm hyper-focused on anymore. My goal is to make the most beautiful object that I can. Now, I will also say, from a standpoint of wood being a fickle mistress, because we know that to be true, you may mill up your wood and cut your joinery, and everything is perfect and flat and goes together wonderfully, and then you set it on your bench. You may even sticker it because you have good practices, and then you come in the next day and the dryads have laughed upon your face, and your wood is now warped. It's cupped over the width. It's another reason I don't really like this joint, because it does happen, and even just a tiny little micro bow cup warp, whatever it is, can affect the way that this joint drives home and make life more difficult. So bear that in mind when you are choosing your joinery, not just the mechanical strength of the joint itself, but actually how you're going to approach the glue up and assemblies of these pieces, because that's a big component of woodworking. So that's all I'll say on that. Tapered sliding dovetail, straight variations, housed mortise and tenons. It's all just joinery. Glue the bloody thing together. Jumping on very briefly to interrupt past Eric for a couple of quick announcements that I'm very excited to share with you guys before we get out of here. First and foremost, I have a Patreon now. So if you're a fan of this channel, if you're a fan of my work across multiple platforms, and you're looking for a way to support what I do, Patreon is the best way to do that. So I'll leave a link down in the description below if that's something you're interested in checking out. Now, secondly, I'm excited to tell you guys about the fact that, I promise I'm not getting naked right now, there's new shirts. Go Make a Thing. The thing that you guys have been asking me to make, a Go Make a Thing t-shirt, is finally available over on Bonfire. I will also leave a link in the description below for that. Wear it loud and proud. It's brand spanking new. It's comfy, it's cozy, and I hope it inspires you to get in the shop and go make a thing. So friends, that's that. That's another video in the books. I hope this was interesting and helpful for you all, and I hope it didn't come across as me telling you not to use a sliding dovetail or condescending in any way. That's not the point of this video. It's just that I have opinions on the thing, and this is not my favorite joint, and a lot of people were asking this question in the comments, and I thought it would be an interesting one to address, because it's kind of held up in that upper echelon of joinery, and frankly, I don't know that it needs to be. But that is a discussion for an entirely different video. This one's done, and I'm gonna go be on my merry way because I have things to build, as do you. So friends, thanks for joining me for another one. And as always, go make a thing, go try to enjoy it if you can, and I'll see you next week. Cheers.